We'll go ahead and start. So, welcome to our virtual Gallier gathering. We are the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. I am Dr. Anastasia Scott. I bid you all good evening. Gallier gatherings are being offered to you as a free service in this virtual platform. If you like our programming, please become a member. Membership has its perks. If you are not a New Orleans or a Louisiana resident, you can take advantage of the North American Reciprocal Museum Association, where you can receive membership benefits with museums and cultural institutions across the United States, El Salvador, Canada, Bermuda, and Mexico. Membership also helps with sponsoring programs such as this. 2021 is our 140th anniversary of the Women's Exchange, our owner and operator of our museums, and the 50th anniversary of the museum. So please join us in celebrating our anniversary by 1, becoming a member, or you can also support us by joining us next month as we celebrate Preservation Month for our April Gallier gathering. Please see our website for more information. If you are impacted financially by COVID-19, we are offering student membership for $25. If you join now, your membership is good through March 2022. If you wish to support us in other ways, please visit our online gift shop to purchase unique gifts from my inventory composed of items from women entrepreneurs, artists, and artisans. You can also make monetary donations for our many programs and initiatives we offer. So a little bit for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, or this is your first time hearing about the Hermann-Grima Gallier Historic Houses. We are managed by the Women's Exchange, which aims to preserve and maintain the architecture and decorative arts of the homes so they may act as a microcosm of life during the 19th and 20th centuries to inspire educational experiences and discourse around our collective past and its contribution to the culture of New Orleans. At the end of each Gallier gathering is a survey we send out asking for your feedback. Please know that we read your feedback and try to make this content as relevant as we can. So please fill out the survey we send out after each Gallier gathering. Your feedback is valuable. In her talk, Miss Zella Palmer will discuss African-American women from the 18th and 19th centuries that contributed to establishing New Orleans' world-famous Creole cuisine. Palmer's research reveals the persona and stories of many who were revered and too many that were invisible. Zella Palmer, professor, food historian, cook, author, and filmmaker, serves as the chair and director of the Ray Charles Program in African American Material Culture at my alma mater, the illustrious Dillard University in New Orleans, Louisiana. Palmer is committed to preserving the legacy of African American, Native American, and Latinx culinary history in New Orleans and in the South. Palmer curated the story of New Orleans Creole cooking, the Black Hand in the Pot, academic conference and documentary, Nellie Murray Feast, and the Dr. Rudy Joseph Lombard Black Hand in the Pot lecture series. In 2019, under Palmer's leadership, Dillard University launched a food studies academic program. Palmer is also the author of the 2019 cookbook, Recipes and Remembrances of Fair Dillard, 1869 to 2019. So a little bit of sort of housekeeping. This talk will be recorded and available for viewing in 24 hours on our YouTube channel and website. Please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss out on any of our future programming. If you have questions at any point during the lecture, please save them until the end or submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So we have a lot of folks on the call. So as far as the Q&A feature is concerned, if you scroll other and read other questions, you can upvote a question to the top if you like the questions that are pretty much similar to yours. So we're likely going to have to use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So don't forget to upvote if there's someone asking a question that you already have. And that helps me to see those questions and they come to the top because you all are already well versed with the chat feature, but I encourage you all to use the Q&A feature. So without further ado, I present to you Miss Zella Palmer.
Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. Special thanks to Hermann-Grima Gallier Historic House for inviting me to present this lecture, The Queen of New Orleans Creole Cuisine, from Tante to Leah Chase. I am humbled and honored to present my research, and I'd also like to give a special thanks to Hermann-Grima Gallier Historic House Board, its members, as well as Tessa Jagger and Dr. Anastasia Scott. So without further ado, let's begin this wonderful evening sharing this incredible history. So I'd like to dedicate this lecture to all of our ancestors, enslaved and free, but especially to my ancestor, Alice Palmer, who was enslaved and sold from Virginia to New Orleans in 1835 and forcibly walked to New Orleans when she was only 14 years old during the domestic slave trade. Great-grandmother Alice was listed as a cook in the 1860 New Orleans census. I honor her tonight and all of the enslaved New Orleans cooks who were invisible. After this lecture is over, I encourage you to watch a documentary my students at Dillard University and I produced on YouTube, The Story of New Orleans Creole Cooking, The Black Hand in the Pot. Next slide, please. So for decades, the contributions and culinary genius of West Africans, Central Africans, and Afro-Caribbeans have always been mentioned as an afterthought. Tonight, that changes. New Orleans has the most diverse Black population in the United States, which would ultimately shape the most unique Southern cuisine that we know as Louisiana Creole cuisine, a cuisine that encompasses cosmopolitan New Orleans and rural Southwest Louisiana. Let us begin this discussion by looking at the 18th century Senegambian period in Louisiana, 1664 to 1674 and 1719 to 1742, where over 5,000 enslaved humans were intentionally trafficked from the Senegambian region of Africa, countries that include Senegal and Gambia. According to the renowned New Orleans scholar, Dr. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, in the 18th century, the French Company of the Indies deliberately trafficked, targeted, and enslaved Senegambians who were skilled with the knowledge of how to cultivate rice. Senegambia, like Louisiana, has a subtropical climate, and the Senegal Valley was very similar to the Mississippi Valley, which would make rice cultivation ripe for growth in the new French colony. According to Charles Seiler, the French specifically instructed the captains of ships bringing the enslaved to produce several Blacks, to quote unquote, produce several Blacks who knew how to cultivate rice, and also to bring 3 or 4 barrels of rice for seeding, which they were to give to the Company of Indies upon arrival in Louisiana. Rice became the most successful early food crop to be cultivated in Louisiana, setting precedent for rice cultivation in other southern states with subtropical climates. Many of the rice dishes that we love in New Orleans and Southwest Louisiana, such as jambalaya, known as jebujin in Senegal, or jollof rice and rice and gravy in Southwest Louisiana, are direct culinary descendants of the Mandingo, Bambara, Wolof, and Moor tribes of Senegambia. In this slide, I included images of the famous city, the Senegalese city Nadar, renamed by the French as Saint Louis in the 17th century. Nadar, or St. Louis, was a major port city. And we have to remember that Creolization began way before the French colony of Louisiana was officially founded in 1719. Here you see a 1757 map by a British printer and publisher, Emmanuel Bowen. If you look closely, this quote unquote Negro land map clearly states what products would be colonized from Africa: grain, gold, and slaves. One thing we need to understand is that Creolization, the mixing of culture and language, began way before enslaved Africans were captured and trafficked to the New World. European men or European traders working for their respective country towards the colonization of the African continent and its people were directed by the Catholic Church, the Pope, and corporations like the Company of the Indies to observe, document, and report back to their respective countries. European traders spent decades abroad in Africa without European women before any human being was trafficked to the New World, eating their cuisine and learning their ways. One of the effective tactics used to colonize and begin the enslavement of African people was to use African women as arbiters between European and African men. Africa, in contrast to Europe, is a matriarchal society. Families, states, tribes, markets, farms, and in some cases, armies historically were ruled by African women. In this slide, we see a few images of Maison d'Esclaves, or House of Slaves, in Gorée Island, Senegal. The women dressed with a cone-shaped headdress were known as Signares. The Signares was an Afro-French ethnic group named by the Portuguese in the 16th century. The Signares controlled trade, business, networks, accumulated assets, and were decision makers in governmental affairs. European men targeted the most powerful women of these coastal cities in West Africa to build relationships and to obtain commercial rights. Common law marriages and offspring between European men and Senegalese women happened often, so much so that it created a powerful class and subculture known as the Signati in Senegal. Through the Signati, European traders were able to acquire wealth, agricultural products, and human beings that would inevitably build tremendous wealth for Europe. Next slide, please. Another period of African enslavement and colonization to Louisiana happened under Spanish colonial rule between 1770 and 1803. According to Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, 4,765 enslaved humans were trafficked from the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra in Nigeria and the Congo in Central Africa. One of the larger ethnic groups enslaved from the Bight of Benin in Nigeria was the Nicaud, or Yoruba tribe, 358 in total. And just a side note, just looking through some of the archives and the runaway slave ads and slave auctions, I found many notes about different tribes and where they were from, and so they can be identified to recapture them again. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, Africa is a matriarchal society. And to understand how powerful some African women were, let us look at Madame Tinubu. During the 19th century, one of the most powerful women from the Yoruba tribe was a woman named Madame Tinubu. Tinubu was an aristocrat, tribal leader, and she created a monopoly as a trader of palm oil, tobacco, salt, and slaves. Tinubu became so powerful and had such an extensive monopoly, the British forced her to exile with military force when she plotted against the British consul, Benjamin Campbell. After her forced exile, Lagos and Nigeria ceded to the British. According to Oladipo Yematan, author of Madame Tinubu, Merchant and Kingmaker, British consul Campbell's goal was to have the capital city of Yoruba land, Lagos, cede to the British and break up her monopoly on the slave trade. Campbell knew it was impossible if Tinubu was still in power. Tinubu had enough wealth to mobilize an army and had great influence with European merchants, enough to request mercenary fighters and warships. A statue of Madame Tinubu remains in Lagos, Nigeria today, paying tribute to her defiance against the British. The Tinubu family remains one of the most powerful and wealthiest families in Nigeria today. Understanding the significant role of African women in geopolitics, pre-slavery, and during colonization will help us to understand cultural and political contributions in New Orleans made by Black women from 1719 to today. Enslaved Africans to Louisiana originated from highly sophisticated, powerful, and ancient skilled cultures, a contradicting narrative perpetuated by European colonial, religious, and academic powers that depicted Africans as savages, uncivilized, or subhuman. Which leads us to the next slide. Bubancha, the original word for Louisiana, meaning the place of many tongues, named by the Choctaw tribe of Louisiana. Prior to the French colonial rule, Louisiana was inhabited and governed by many indigenous tribes, such as the Atacapa, Choctaw, Natchitoches, Chickasaw, Tangipahoa, and more. By the time the French arrived in Louisiana in the 17th century, Louisiana was abundant with wild game, fish, fruit, and vegetables. The indigenous use of filet powder from the sassafras tree would contribute to the creation of filet gumbo. Snapping turtles would contribute to the creation of cowan soup, and the medicinal and culinary use of elderberry would cure many colds. The creolization of African and indigenous people to Louisiana would develop a rich culture, cuisine, and in many instances, offspring documented by the Spanish Louisiana colonial powers as griff, half African and half indigenous. One of the earliest paintings depicting a cultural exchange between two oppressed peoples was in 1735 called The Drawing of the Savages of Several Nations by a French architect and illustrator named Alexandre de Betz. In this illustration, we see a young African and indigenous child glancing at each other. The young African child is wearing the same indigenous tribal attire. Clearly, the African child is a member of the tribe or very familiar with Atacapa that de Betz mentioned. A further look at early illustrations of African and indigenous peoples to Louisiana, we further see evidence of cultural exchanges between African and indigenous women. Scenes of the French market were depicted often in American magazines, such as the Harper's Weekly of indigenous women selling gumbo filet, intricate geometrical woven baskets passed down from their ancestors, sassafras bark, herbs for every ailment, and vite-ve, a popular New Orleans perfume fragrance. Black and indigenous women sold their wares side by side in the French market. Interestingly, one American illustrator noted the depiction of indigenous women vendors as silent. Another illustration depicts 3 indigenous women selling gumbo, and this final illustration of the 19th century New Orleans French market depicts African and indigenous women as subservient vendors while white Creoles purchase items in camaraderie. The life of Black and indigenous marchands or street vendors was hard. I will explain later why. Next slide, please. New Orleans geographically was one of the most important port cities during French, Spanish, and American colonial rule. New Orleans was a direct hub to countries involved in the slave trade like Cuba and Haiti, and pivotal to the Atlantic and domestic slave trade. One second, please. Black women continue to retain cultural memory of the politics of the market and culinary traditions of Africa and the Caribbean. While conducting research about enslaved cooks in New Orleans, I was blown away by written notes of brokers and accountants during slavery who created a system of classification to identify the skill level and expertise of enslaved cooks for sale. Excellent cooks were sold for higher amounts, as much as $1,500, equivalent to $50,000 today. $50,000 today. Tolerable cooks were sold at a cheaper price, but nonetheless were sold at an asking price higher than field hands. In research, I even found runaway ads and slave auction notices listing bakers, butchers, and ship cooks for sale. European traders were very clear that Africans and their descendants were highly skilled and integral to the building of the New World, even if their literature and propaganda didn't say that. The life of an enslaved cook was not easy at all. Enslaved cooks and bakers were in constant contact with their oppressors, tending fires, burning themselves often, and in some instances, food was rationed as a form of control and torture. Frederick Douglass discussed how food was used as a weapon from his own personal experience living as an enslaved youth. He said, quote unquote, "I have often been so pinched with hunger that I have fought with the dog, old Nep, for the smallest crumbs that fell from the kitchen table, and have been glad when I won a single crumb in the combat." He wrote in My Bondage and My Freedom. Many times I have followed with eager step the waiting girl when she went out to shake the tablecloth to get the crumbs and small bones flung out for the cats. Enslaved Black women living within the confines of their owner's home in New Orleans were living under constant fear, making sure that their service was impeccable. Each course had a new table setting. Each dish must be cooked to perfection to please the mistress so that she pleases her husband in New Orleans society or fear of retribution. The story of Solomon Northup, the free man of color kidnapped and sold into slavery in Louisiana, reveals so much about the life of the ancienne population or planter class and how sex and food were used as weapons of control, not only from the white male planter, but the white female planter as well. An enslaved cook would oftentimes be freed after decades of service for not poisoning their masters, which did oftentimes happen. During the 1811 slave revolt in New Orleans, many of the enslaved persons, on the slave coast, on the German coast, many of the slave persons who participated in the rebellion were cooks and bakers, working day in and day out under the most toxic conditions and environments. It was common for the enslaved cook and baker serving the planter to be used in both residences, in the German coast, Plantation Road, and in New Orleans during the fall and spring months. By the end of the Civil War, next slide. By the end of the Civil War, a newly freed Black population flooded New Orleans from the plantations looking for food, shelter, and work. Many of the wives of the Confederacy were now widows and lost their free labor. This is where the cookbook becomes integral to helping Southern white women post-Civil War learn how to cook, since the Tante, translated from French to English, meaning the aunt of mine, or in early New Orleans or Louisiana cookbooks, refers to Black enslaved women cooks. One of the most popular cookbooks printed and published in 1901, while formerly enslaved women were still alive, was the Picayune Creole's cookbook. Reading the introduction, we can clearly interpret how enslaved Black women cooks were the culinary matriarchs of the world-famous Louisiana Creole cuisine. Tante Zoe, that is mentioned in the Picayune Creole cookbook, as you see on the slide, and I'll give you all a second to read it. Tante Zoe metaphorically represents generations of enslaved New Orleans and Louisiana Black women who tended the fires, set the tables, fed the house, and the enslaved, lived under the most toxic conditions, only to have their recipes gathered and collected without compensation again. I'll give you a second just to read the slide. These are excerpts from the Picayune Creole cookbook, one of the most famous New Orleans Creole cookbooks. As you see in the second slide, I think the last paragraph, I'll just read it quickly. But the Civil War, with its vast upheavals of social conditions, wrought great changes in the household economy of New Orleans, as it did throughout the South. Here as elsewhere, she who had ruled as the mistress of yesterday became her own cook today. In 9 cases out of 10, the younger darkies accepted their freedom with alacrity. But in many ancient families, the older Creole negresses, as they were called, were slow to leave the haunts of the old cuisine and the families of which they felt themselves an integral part. Now, today we can interpret a lot from that, perhaps because now these old formerly enslaved women they were unable to provide for themselves. So next slide, please. But there was one woman who would use the system to her advantage, Nellie Murray, the queen of Creole cuisine in the early 19th century. Murray, third generation enslaved cook at the governor of Louisiana, Paul Octave Hebert's family plantation in Bayou Gullah, Louisiana, was for generations she watched and learned from her grandmother and mother on how the finest feasts and table decor were set. In her 30s, Murray was freed by de facto after the Civil War and would move to New Orleans from the Bayou Gullah plantation to become a world famous chef and caterer for New Orleans, New York, Chicago, and European society elites. Next please. In 1893, Murray was invited to be the chef de cuisine at the Chicago World's Fair, Louisiana exhibition. Here she introduced Creole cuisine to the world stage. There was a line around the State House waiting to try her delectable dishes. Nellie stayed in Chicago for a year, catering for the most elite society. Murray amassed a fortune. At the same fair, Nancy Green would portray Aunt Jemima for Davis Milling Company, who owned the Aunt Jemima pancake mix, where the global market could get a taste of the stereotypical happy enslaved female cook. By the end of the fair, Davis Milling Company made over 50,000 orders. You can get a taste of slavery through your pancakes in every home worldwide. I include an image of an 1894 article in the Daily, and from the very conservative Daily Picayune article, where Nellie's opinion on European cooking was valued. A lengthy 2-page article only 29 years after slavery, where a quote unquote swarthy, formerly enslaved cook to the Louisiana governor was now traveling to Berlin, Paris, Chicago, and New York, dazzling her clientele with her joie de vivre and moussances. Nellie was the Josephine Baker of the culinary world right in New Orleans. By the time Nellie died in 1918, her appointment books were filled, and she had sent all of her kin to New Orleans University, the predecessor of Dillard University. Her descendant today, Alden McDonald Jr., owns Liberty Bank that we know in New Orleans. Next slide. Some of the earliest documentation of enslaved African women reveals their roles as marchands, or street food vendors in English, who sold cooked food, produce, pralines, pecan candies, callas, fried rice fritters, and café noir or café au lait, drip coffee, along the levees and throughout the French Quarter. An 18th century coffee vendor named Rose Nicaud was documented for her beloved drip coffee sold from her pushcart and stand in the French market. Nicaud was once enslaved, and she was able to purchase her freedom and buy 3 vendor stalls in the French market. A 1764 court document gives insight into the lives of 18th century enslaved New Orleans African women and how African culinary practices and market skills were transferred from Africa. The court document of runaway African maroons also mentioned the earliest documentation of reinterpreted West and Central African okra soup, gumbo. Comba and Louison were both Mandingo women in their 50s. They were vendors, marchands de gâteaux, selling cakes and other goods along the streets of New Orleans. They maintained an active social life, organized feasts where they ate and drank very well, cooked gumbo filet and rice, roasted turkey and chickens, barbecued pigs and fish, smoked tobacco, and drank rum. Like St. Louis, Senegal, Signaris, New Orleans was known for its class of free women of color who wielded some authority and oftentimes owned or managed real estate, groceries, butcher shops, bakeries, and taverns. In the 1795 New Orleans census, a morena libre, free woman of color named Carlotta Dennerville was noted as a tavern keeper and owner of several rental properties. Next slide. The French Black Code, or Code Noir, forbade enslaved people from selling commodities, provisions, or produce of any kind without the written permission of their masters and an identification badge. A fine of 1,500 leva would be imposed on enslaved vendors for not adhering to the law. Lafcadio Hearn, the American writer, wrote about the bustling economy along the levees of the marchands, the street vendors, and victualets, the hot cooked food vendors. Etienne de Bory, one of the wealthiest Louisiana sugar planters and enslaved owners, and John McDonough made a fortune off of enslaved marchands or street vendors. De Bory made at least $6,000 a year from enslaved vendors, and McDonough $400 to $700 a week. In the Louisiana Notarial Archives, evidence of vendor permits where enslaved owners were required to apply for their enslaved peddlers to sell in the streets. The owners did not have to pay duty, or as we say today, taxes on profits made. The owner could cancel the permit at any time, and it was up to the owner if they wanted to pay their enslaved peddler a portion of the proceeds made during the week. One of the stories that really stood out to me in this research and just understanding the history of Black street food vendors was Zabet. Zabet was a Black pralinaire in the 1900s. And you could find her, story goes that you could find her in front of St. Louis Cathedral and the Cabildo. In many accounts, it was stated that her admiration was for quote unquote royal blood. Now we can make our own interpretations today that she was probably looking for a tip from the aristocrats or the society elite to make a living wage. So oftentimes Black women and Black men, but have both had to reduce themselves to subservient nature or cowing nature so that they could get a higher tip. As slavery ended and the years passed, the image of the Black pralinaires continued in the French Quarter. Brick and mortar shops that learned the praline recipes would now make a fortune in the tourist industry. Aunt Sally's original Creole praline shop once had a Black pralinaire mannequin to entice tourists to buy the sweet pecan treat. And dotted throughout the French Quarter, indigenous mannequins lured tourists to buy cigars and other trinkets. Today, we no longer hear the cries of the Black marchands singing Becala, to show Becala, bel fromage, bel chorizo, pralines, pistache pecans. What is left are pralines and boiled eggs in corner and commercial stores where New Orleans Black street vendors once sold their fried fritters known as calas, reminiscent of Africa and Haiti, figs, estomac mulâtre, ginger cakes, pralines, confections, oysters, popcorn, cuisine d'ors, cooked meals in canteens delivered right to your door during post-Civil War slavery. Gone once food regulations, brick and mortar, and the appropriation of Afro-Creole cuisine into commercial spaces became the norm, and of course, the end of slavery. Next slide. The legacy of the early Afro-Creole culinary matriarchs would continue in not only commercial spaces, but in acts of kindness from women like Honorable Henriette de Lille, a Catholic nun who founded the Sisters of the Holy Family in 1836. She would serve food to the enslaved and the newly freed. Even the voodoo queen Marie Laveau would bring hot food to those on death row. Many rumored that she brought their last meal at request of Gumbo before they were hanged. Next slide. As time would pass and slavery ended, and we look at the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 19th century, the famous Lulu White, Madame of all Madames in Storyville, the red light district on Basin Street in the early 19th century, in the late 19th century, enticed her clientele into her Mahogany Hall brothel with ads in a blue book, the OnlyFans of the time, enticing white men to illicit behavior with mixed race women from the Old South, a taste of the finest wines, and a plate of red beans and rice. Lulu White understood the power of sex, the fetishization of Black women, food, hospitality, wine, and spirits. Next slide. By the 1930s, Black women dominated domestic labor as cooks and seamstresses in New Orleans. One Black woman would become the Nellie Murray of the time. Lena Richard, formerly a domestic cook, built an empire. By the 1940s, Lena became a restaurateur, caterer, cookbook author, frozen food entrepreneur, culinary school owner, and a teacher. In 1949, a year after New Orleans WDSU network went live on American television, Lena Richard became the first TV celebrity chef preparing dishes that Black women had made for centuries in New Orleans. Ruth Zadaran remembered taking out a pen and pencil in case she picked up new recipes and tips. Ms. Zadaran said she cooked the kind of food that New Orleanians were used to eating, not restaurant food, not all that fancy food. And when she was talking to you, it was like you were talking to her in the kitchen. Next slide. And then there was Leah Chase, the next queen of Creole cuisine to take the throne. Ms. Leah understood the power of the table and networks. Her vision to turn her in-laws and husband's sandwich shop into a fine dining restaurant for Black patrons was ingenious. There weren't many places African Americans could dress up and dine during segregation. Black homemakers would turn their dining rooms into galatoirs, even if all they had were potato sack bags that they had stitched together to make a dining room table cover. They used what they had, as Miss Leah once said. Dookie Chase Jr. and Leah Chase built a New Orleans institution in the height of the Jim Crow South, which would eventually attract American and international presidents, celebrities, and everyday New Orleanians who adored her fried chicken, and gumbo. And one of the last interviews she did before her death in 2019 in my book, Recipes and Remembrances of Fair Dillard, 1869 to 2019, she talked about how African Americans became entrepreneurs. She said, "We were never taught how to run a business. We just did it. It's amazing how they taught themselves. We had to live with each other to succeed. What powerhouses and resources they lost by keeping us back. Had you educated them, things would have been a lot different, but they couldn't see that. So we just rose above it and kept going." Next slide. Black women in New Orleans, from the Tante Zoes to Miss Linda Green, the Yakameen lady, were and are the culinary matriarchs of the world famous New Orleans Creole cuisine. From the frying of meats and fritters, boiling of seafood, slow cooked soups and stews, to the sweet treats in Africa and Haiti, to New Orleans streets, to the countless versions of gumbos made in different wards, society homes, balls, and functions from the 18th century to today. The dough glacé that Nellie Murray made that was passed down from her grandmother that cooked all day on the stove, to the redfish coubillon, cultural memories of Senegal, Gambia, Congo, Benin, Nigeria, Haiti, and Cuba, and the peppery flavor of yakameen reminiscent of Nigerian catfish pepper soup. Creole white beans with shrimp reminiscent of Nigerian Igbo white bean soup. I can go on and on to trace many of New Orleans and Louisiana dishes back to Africa, for it was the flavor, the funk, the jazz, the soul, the rhythm, and the preparation made by the men, but especially the women that made Creole cuisine. Thank you. Open for any questions if anybody has any. Hey.
Sure. Oh my gosh, that was so good. A few things I want to say right off the bat. I didn't know anything about Miss Lena Richard. That's my first time hearing about Miss Lena Richard. Never heard of her before tonight. So thank you for that. That was amazing.
Secondly, I'm glad you all liked it.
Yeah. Secondly, speaking of Chef Linda Green, we have a K through 12 program. I just want to put that plug in. On March 22nd, we have a K through 12 program where Chef Linda Green will be doing a cooking demo for the youth, as well as talking to them about her rise to stardom. So for you adults, if you have some of your youth in your life, if you wanted more information, please see our website. But on March 22nd, Chef Linda Green will be speaking to the youth. So please see our website, speaking of her. So those are the two things I immediately wanted to say, but we do have a lot of questions. So Zella, I'll dive right in. Thank you so much. I had no idea about Miss Lena Richard.
Yes. Before there was Martha Stewart, there was Lena Richard.
So I'll just go right in. So the first question that's up. Thank you all for using the upvote feature. I love it. I love it. Such a great option. What does Jacqueline mean?
Well, if we go back to the last slide, can we pull up the last slide?
Okay. Let me go back.
Okay, so if you see in the right-hand corner, that is an early picture from Storyville, from Basin Street. And if you look closely, if you zoom in on the sign, we have to remember that we once had a Chinatown in New Orleans, and it was in Storyville, and Chinese immigrants were in New Orleans. And the restaurants, they open a lot of the restaurants, and you have to also remember that, you know, New Orleans is a majority Black population. So the Chinese, you know, were not assimilated into the white neighborhoods. So Chinese restaurants, you know, were in Black neighborhoods. And so to assimilate to Black flavor palette, they created this dish called yakameen. And I'm sure there were also African American cooks that were cooking alongside them, because it wasn't a large Chinese population in New Orleans. And if you look at the sign and closely, it says yakameen right there. And there's a little boy that's sticking out of that door and looking out. So that is a picture from Storyville on Basin Street.
And it looks like the spelling of it changed too, because that looks like yet yak mean. That's
exactly.
I see chop suey, I see chicken chop suey on the list, but I see yet yak mean. So thank you for that. Oh my gosh.
Sure. And you know, things change over time. I mean, we once spelled crawfish as CRAYFISH. So things change over, pronunciation and spelling change over time.
And secondly, I didn't know we had a Chinatown.
Yes, we did.
I didn't know New Orleans had a Chinatown. That's
in Storyville.
That's so interesting. Okay, let me get to the question. I'm sorry. Answer live. Did Lena Richard have a show before Julia Child?
Well, clearly it was in the 1940s, so she was one of the first on American television. And so when did Julia Child's show come out? I mean, and here's the challenge with you know, Lena Richard's live television. She put out that show before we could record television. So we have no proof. We have not proof. I'm sorry. We have no recordings of her show. All we have are images that she was on the show and memories from some elders who were still alive. And of course, Miss Lena's family.
Thank you. So the cookbook that you mentioned, the Creole cookbook, the Picayune Creole cookbook, the question to that is, would that be the best basic cookbook to purchase and start with?
You know, it's one of the most popular cookbooks. You know, it's a huge Bible. It's about this big, you know, but it's fascinating to read it, and you start learning this is what enslaved Black women and Black men who were in those kitchens were preparing for society elites. you know? And so when you see the breadth of, you know, dishes, I mean, just the menus, it is nothing like we can imagine today. I mean, they were living like they were in Versailles.
Someone in the chat said Julia Child's show premiered in the 1960s.
Thank you. So of course, so then yes, Lena Richard, hers came out in a year, was that 1940? I think I wrote that down, the exact date. Let me go back. 1949, I think it was.
Okay. So thank you all for using this upload feature. It's working because it the next votes. So the next question is, do you know if anyone has ever done the genealogy on this group of women and found that they are related to each other?
On what group of women?
I'm just assuming they didn't say. I'm just assuming the group of women that you just spoke about.
No, I did the genealogy on Nellie Murray. And, you know, I've done the genealogy on my own family, but, you know, I'm always excited to hear other people dig in those archives. And, you know, what makes it special about New Orleans is that the Spanish and French documented everything. So you can find your people, you know, and that wasn't necessarily the case in other American cities. But the Spanish and the French gave tremendous detail. So the tribal, if there was runaway slave ads, you know, or slave auction, if you had a tribal mark, you had a left, you know, this is before Social Security numbers, you know, so they had to describe people to the T. And, you know, they documented where people lived, the New Orleans census, you know, all of these records can be found, and you can trace and do the genealogy of certain individuals.
Sure. So yeah, that cookbook, just the answer we talked about it is Picayune Creole Cookbook. So that answered a lot of you all's questions. Thank you for upvoting. So I am gonna do the question that's upvoted. I missed the 20. Okay, let me go back. Fast forward. I know there was ancestral memory with these recipes, but did you discover any vegetable or herb gardening practices that have ties to the motherland? Did the cooks implement any garden habits that were passed on to supply their dishes?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, even today, African women are the majority farmers on the continent. So of course, those same practices were used and, you know, in the New World. And it was very clear. I think early on in my talk, you know, I talked about how they wanted, you know, cultivators of rice from the Senegambian region to be brought to Louisiana to produce that product in a subtropical climate. So those practices were put into place in the New World. Rice cultivation was not a practice in Europe. It was a practice in Africa and Asia. And so it was brought to the New World to create a fortune.
Thank you. So there will be a list that's sent out at a later date in terms of all the references that Zella used to put this together. So I'll just answer that. That will be sent out to you all, everyone that registered for the event. Next question. In your research, did you come across any brewisters or distillers? As a brewer, I'm always looking to connect with the brewsters that came before me.
I didn't find any. I did find tavern keepers. It was very common for Black women to own sandwich shops and taverns. Free Black women, of course. And then I didn't specifically find a barista, but you could call Rose Nicaud, you know, she was definitely a coffee barista. You know, her drip coffee was famous. You know, they compared her coffee to one of the best, you know, Catholic sermons around. And she was able to, purchased 3 vendor stalls in the French market. Nellie Murray was also known for her drip coffee. She made drip coffee for and 1,005 sandwiches for soldiers before they went off to Cuba during the American, Cuban Civil War. So, there were definitely, enslaved women and enslaved men that were sold to taverns, especially fancy women, the quote unquote term fancy women. I found many accounts of that, of tavern owners purchasing fancy women, which was usually mixed race women who went for a higher price and then would become concubines of these slave owners.
Thank you. Next question. As a Latinx woman, I find it insulting when food trends become appropriated, i.e. avocado toast.
Mm-hmm.
And that also with this cuisine as well. How do cooks honor these histories and cuisines without exploitation?
Well, I think giving credit, which is why in the beginning of my talk, I talked a lot about, I'm sorry, let me just get some. Okay, so, people in the, I don't know why my internet is going out. Okay, so in the beginning of my talk, I talked a lot about how, food was appropriated, and how even today, many historians mention the contributions of African people last. Usually it's always mentioned as the French, the Spanish, maybe they'll mention the Native Americans, but it's always the French, the Spanish, Native Americans, and Africans are always mentioned as a forethought. So as an afterthought. So I'm hoping that that narrative will change, based on all the research that is coming out and that is out there, that we can start actually lifting up the stories of those invisible cooks.
Thank you. Can you talk about the origins of gumbo and jambalaya?
Sure. Gumbo is, an African Bantu word from the word in Combo. And it is a soup, similar to soup ganja in Senegal, similar to many seafood-based soups that incorporated okra, and later in the New World, filet, and was brought into the New World, but is almost identical to certain soups in West and Central Africa, as soup kanja in Senegal and okra soup in Nigeria and other parts of West Africa.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question. Are there records from Mahogany Hall, employment records? Rumor has it my great-grandmother was a cook there.
There's, I can get you the reference later, but there is, I think his name is Al Rose. He wrote an incredible book where he was able to interview former workers in Storyville. And there was, and also the New Orleans Historic Collection did an exhibit a couple of years ago, I think it was like 3-4 years ago, that talked about Storyvilles, and they, have tons of research and information about Storyville, who worked there, who lived there. And, I was really fascinated with Lulu White. I was fascinated by the fact, learning about Chinatown and Storyville. And Al Rose, his book, you can order it on Amazon, is incredible. And just even some of the interviews, I remember reading one interview of a Dominican woman from Dominican Republic who came here when she was 16 years old. And she worked in Storyville in the brothel houses. And she talked about, in her broken English, talked about sending little boys to run and get them some po' boys after they finished, doing what they were doing. So that, it's fascinating.
Thank you so much. So next question. Who sold the drip coffee from the stall? I did not catch the name.
Rose Nicaud.
Okay.
And there was a coffee shop named after her that just closed a couple of years ago on Frenchman Street. It was a family that, to pay homage to Rose Nicaud, opened an African-American family in New Orleans who opened the shop that was open for many years. So it was Rose Nicaud. Her last name is Nicaud.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Has any of your research provided any information about the quadroon balls? By the way, the early 1600 information in Africa was really interesting. You could do a focused discussion on that period alone.
Well, Madame Trevine, who gave a talk with Hermann-Grima and, noted historian in New Orleans, there's no, according to her research, there are no, proof or evidence thus far that has been found that mentions quadroon balls. Quadroon balls and the idea of quadroon balls were also a way to fetishize and, create this myth of white men choosing, mixed race women and out of a crowd. But the cohabitation was a practice, not placage. Cohabitation was a practice where, Black women were, kind of not recruited, but they were part of a system where white enslaved owners or the planter class would, have a common law marriage with Black women and would oftentimes provide for those women. And if they had offspring, they would be baptized in the Catholic Church. And we also have to remember that there was a time where Black women had a higher population in New Orleans. French women French women, if you all remember the story of the Casket Girls, had to be sent to the New World in Louisiana to increase the population, the white population, because there weren't that many French or Spanish women who wanted to come to Louisiana. I mean, it was, yellow fever, the swamp, the heat. So many French women who lost their fortune or were sent to Louisiana and were called the Casket Girls. It's actually a really good book called The Casket Girls, were sent to Louisiana to marry French men so that there would be an even balance and, more French, population than African population in New Orleans and Louisiana. Mm-hmm.
How can visitors to New Orleans experience traditional food and learn more? Do you do culinary tours? If not,
I don't do culinary tours, but you can, I've been encouraging chefs for a long time to bring some of these lost dishes back. I was so proud of the Munch Factory recently. They offered redfish courtbouillon as an item on a Saturday menu, and it was divine. And we have to remember that courtbouillon was as popular at one time as gumbo. And how do we know that? Because your alma mater, Dr. Scott, Dillard University student newspaper is named after that famous dish, courtbouillon. And in the 1935 student newspaper, the first student newspaper editorial letter they talked about their love for courtbouillon and how it was, you know, as popular as gumbo, and that they wanted to dish up some words and interviews and stories for the first class of Dillard University in 1935. So courtbouillon was very popular. And then when the Nellie Murray Feast, when I curated along with some incredible New Orleans women from the Whitney Plantation, from, you know, the Rhodes family, Ariel Harris. I mean, we curated this amazing dinner to bring the story of Nellie Murray to life and to raise funds for Leah Chase, the Leah Chase documentary for WLAE. And Chef Duke Chase, he, Miss Leah's grandson, he made daube glacé, Nellie Murray's dish. And so to have that, and then Miss Leah had this, you know, memory of Creoles eating, Afro Creoles eating daube, you know, for breakfast with French bread, which is kind of like a liver pate, but made out of beef. And she shared her recipe with her grandson. That just made me so happy. So, you know, there's so many dishes, and you'll see them in the Picayune Creole cookbook and other Louisiana Creole cookbooks that need to come back to restaurants and the dinner table. I mean, there's also, you know, old elders who talk about waking up a Mardi Gras morning and their mother would make them collage, you know, but you don't see collage anywhere. You know, it's very, and most of the times it's in someone's house or an elder remembers making it, but you don't see collage everywhere. You see beignets, but you don't see collage. So hopefully we can continue to bring those things back. But if you know, Dookie Chase Restaurant, Lunch Factory, you know, even Antoine's, you know, they make Cafe Brûlot. You know, these are historic Creole dishes and coffees, and that we need to continue to preserve and serve.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How influential was the directive of the slave-only family in the creation of Creole cuisine? Were the enslaved cooks essentially given artistic freedom in the kitchen, or were they told what to cook based on the interests of their masters?
Say that one more time.
So when the enslaved cooks were given directives by the slave-only family, were they given sort of artistic freedom when they cooked, or was it solely based on the directives of the slaveholding family?
Well, you know, enslaved people never had any freedom, right? It depended on the mistress of the house. So, you know, here both of these cultures, or both of these ethnic groups, are in foreign land for the first time, right? Many of the dishes that were made in France can no longer be made in, you know, in Louisiana. So you had to use what you had, you know, available to you, right? And so many of the mistresses, depending on the class and socioeconomic status, were dependent on enslaved women to prepare the meals, not only for the house, but also for the field, right? So, you know, of course, and if you look back at the introduction to the Picayune Creole cookbook that was published in 1901, you know, they talk about how the mistresses were in control and directed the negresses to cook. But when you look at the recipes and breadth, it is both a mix of Africa and it is also a mix of France. And like I said before, Creolization began way before Louisiana was founded in 1719. So, you know, the cuisines were also being taken, and agricultural products were also being taken to Europe. So in a way, you can also say that Europe had started to become Africanized.
Thank you all. I do see a lot of requests for books. That list will be sent out, but we do have in our gift shop one similar book called Creole Cookery.
Yes.
So you can purchase that online, and that is also sort of on par with this tradition. Creole Cookery was published initially in 1885. And then, as Zella was saying, the Picayune Creole Cookbook was purchased in 1901. So we do have that for sale in our gift shop. So you can see our online gift shop, or you can definitely stop by the shop. What about, next question, what about African collaboration with original Cajun cooking? How did the two meet and influence each other?
Well, let's be clear. Cajun cuisine is nothing like Acadian cuisine in Nova Scotia. If you go to Nova Scotia today and taste Acadian cuisine, there is really no comparison. So when Acadians, Acadian, or Cajuns came to Louisiana, they learned from Native Americans, and they learned from descendants of Africa on how to survive and how to cook, hunt, fish off the land in the environment that they were in. They went from a very cold Canada to a subtropical climate in the swamps of Louisiana. So, you know, at one time we were all Creole, right? And Creole was, Creole has had many definitions, but just before the Louisiana Purchase, and, even years afterwards, if you were born in Louisiana, you were Creole. Just like if we are born in the United States, we're American, right? So it depends on who was the colonial power. Of course, that changed after slave revolts in 1811, and the naming of Creole became a marker for either it transcended into either being African American or being a lighter skinned African American. But originally Creole was born native to Louisiana, and that included Native Americans, that included Europeans who were born here, as well as people of African descent.
Thank you. So, any foods or restaurants from Haiti in New Orleans?
Yes, there is. I think it's called Frites. Yes, Frites de Nola. I think it's in what's the name of that? On St. Claude. What's the name of it's on the tip of my tongue. Thank you, Tessa. Tessa, please check the chat box and she can tell you. Yes. But we owe red beans and rice to Haitians. When I talked about the diversity of Black, had one of the largest diverse Black populations in the United States. That is true. The Haitian Revolution was a further influx and injection of Black culture from the Caribbean that brought its own culture and food. Red beans and rice was specific to New Orleans. It was not, popular in the rest of Louisiana, because Haitians were immigrated and were exiled to New Orleans during after the Haitian Revolution.
Thank you so much. So this is interesting. So should we get rid of Aunt Jemima brand if it's based on Nellie Murray? And following this, it's still part of the same question. I think you mentioned Nellie Murray passed something on to the descendants. Does anything still exist today, like a restaurant, etc.? And this is all still the same question or a series of questions. And did Lena Richard leave anything behind that still exists today?
So Lena Richard has many cookbooks and you can purchase them. I collect cookbooks. I collect as many New Orleans and Louisiana cookbooks as I possibly can. And her family, interestingly enough, one of her family members reached out to me maybe an hour before this talk. And, I would love to follow up with them and learn more about her, as well as Nellie Murray, her descendant. I mean, through my research, I was able to learn that Alden McDonald Jr., who is the founder and owner of Liberty Bank, is her descendant. So that fascinates me. Nellie was sued in the Daily Picayune, which, later became the Times Picayune. Nellie was sued by her own sister close to her death. And her sister lost the case, but it's unclear what happened to Nellie's fortune, but she definitely amassed a fortune. And the article is clear that she amassed a fortune from, traveling all over the world and, being a critical to serving society elite who still had the capacity to pay after the Civil War. So I think Nellie Murray's contribution or her contribution to wasn't a brick and mortar. I mean, she was the caterer, so she never had brick and mortar, but it was her contribution to African American society by her donations that she gave donations to many organizations, clubs. She also, volunteered, like I said, and she served 1,005 sandwiches to soldiers. She was the caterer for Susan B. Anthony, the woman suffragist, and when they had their women's suffragist convention in New Orleans. So, her contribution, she also owned a house on Leah Chase Street, which is fascinating. And she lived there with her modiste, which means basically she was with a dressmaker. So she lived with another Black woman. And like I said, it's unclear what happened to her wealth, but her nephews, she was able to send to New Orleans University. And one of them became a dentist. Yeah, one of them became a dentist and opened up a dental clinic in Liberia.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You all are a great audience. There's so many questions to choose from. Give me a moment. What happened to New Orleans' Chinatown?
Well, China, I'm sorry. One of the, Storyville was shut down. So, with that, many people moved, like Louis Armstrong, who moved to Chicago, and those who are out of work moved to Chicago, either there or other places. And then some people assimilated into just, regular daily life. And there weren't that many, Chinese immigrants that continue to have a further influx of immigration into New Orleans. And later Asian, populations from Vietnam would come. So that Vietnamese cuisine became the standard of food rather than Chinese food. So it's unclear what happened to many of the Chinese immigrants who moved during that time to New Orleans. But I'm sure they might have, they probably moved to another city if they had family or if they were, elderly or up in age, to places like New York or San Francisco. But once, those businesses were closed down in the entire red light district, a huge source of revenue, was lost in New Orleans, and culture and tradition. But, if Storyville wouldn't have closed by the U.S. government, then jazz probably would have stayed in New Orleans and wouldn't have, migrated to places like Chicago and New York. There's an incredible film. I mean, you know, a lot of us are watching the Billie Holiday movie now. And there's a film on YouTube actually that you can access with Louis Armstrong and Billie Holiday about New Orleans. And it's a, I think, 1930s film, and it is about Storyville closing. And it's fascinating. It's a black and white film about Storyville closing and how, you know, all these artists and jazz musicians left New Orleans because they had no choice.
Wow, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What is your favorite Creole meal?
Ooh, oh yeah, no, that's hard. I love, of course, everybody loves a good gumbo, you know, and you know, there's so many different kinds of gumbos out there. And when I do the research, you know, it's when you listen to people say, oh, you know, that's not a gumbo, and it's evolved over time. You know, there were many recipes for gumbo, right? And it was based on the abundant, and there, you know, there were times where there wasn't any flour, you know, in the New World. And so, you know, filet was used as a thickener. Okra was used as a thickener. But I mean, I love a good gumbo and a scoop of potato salad. I love redfish courtbouillon, you know, I've dough glacé, you know, all of these dishes I just adore. I love cafe brulee, you know, just to see the orange and lime peels with the cloves in them, and then the brandy, you know, and or cognac, you know, on fire, and my coffee is just so fragrant and beautiful. So I mean, it's so many Creole dishes, and that's the fascinating part of about it is, you know, New Orleans has one of the most unique cuisines in the world. And we see that based on the many cookbooks that were published in the 19th century and that were created, you know, by mostly Black women.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting that's happening. Thank you all to the former Hermann-Grima Gallier cooking docents. You all are reaching out, and one of the former docents is saying we used to make redfish courtbouillon in the tin kitchen in the hearth at Hermann-Grima Gallier.
I'll be done.
To all of you former cooking docents that are reaching out. So I see your comments, and thank you so much for reaching out and attending. That's amazing. For those of you who don't know, we do have an 1830s kitchen, and we do cooking demonstrations. Of course, as with anyone, we have been impacted by COVID-19, but we plan to make a comeback in terms of our cooking demonstrations for our 1830s kitchen, for those of you who don't know. Next question.
And I didn't touch on the kitchen, but you know, the kitchen, the historic kitchen in the Hermann-Grima house. I mean, that kitchen, you know, was one of the top of the line kitchens during that time. You know, so if you all tour it, you know, you will see one of, you know, kitchens that most New Orleans residents didn't have. You know, and so. You know, and just imagine, you know, enslaved women, children, and men also attending to those fires, and women with the many layers of, you know, cloth, you know, dress on them, having to make sure that they don't, their skirts don't catch on fire, you know, and still be having to serve, you know, courses. I mean, you know, they, if you read some of the menus in the Pecune Creole cookbook and some of the other menus that you see, you know, you look at it and you just say, wow, you know, they had to sometimes 5-6 courses, you know, and each course they had to clear the table and set a new setting. So I know some of the Hermann-Grima docents who worked in the kitchen know exactly what I'm talking about. It was tremendous labor.
Thank you. So, that's a really good question. Okay. you pronounce Richard as Richard. Is this a predecessor of Richard's foods?
Well, in New Orleans, there's two different pronunciations for people's name, but I understood that her family name was pronounced Richard. And if I'm incorrect, please do, forgive me for that, because I know there's for example, a Highdale and a Haydale, so, but there's definitely sometimes two different last names.
Sure.
Pronunciations.
As a Creole chef, descended from Kid Ori, how would you explain the difference between Creole cuisine versus Cajun? I have a definition, but I would love to hear yours.
Cajun cuisine is Creole cuisine. And I say that because Creole cuisine was the first. And we were all Creoles, even before some were Cajuns. Okay. There was already a rich cuisine in the swamps and in the Southwest Louisiana and in cosmopolitan New Orleans before Cajuns came to Louisiana. So when we talk about Creole cuisine, it's not just New Orleans, it's also Southwest Louisiana, right? It's rural country Creole cooking in Southwest Louisiana. And in New Orleans, it's cosmopolitan, Creole cuisine. So Cajuns, of course, each culture and ethnic group is going to make things their own. Just as new immigrants who come to the, New Orleans, they make their gumbos the way they do, right? And then they call it, their gumbo. So, it's each ethnic group that came to New Orleans and Louisiana had their own spin on dishes that were already here.
Thank you. A lot of you are asking about recommendations for books. We will send that out to the list of registrants at a later date. So I won't be asking about, there's a lot of questions about, all kind of books. So we will send that out at a later date to everyone who's registered, just to let you all know. So I'll move on to the other questions. What's the name of the Senegalese gumbo light dish? Can you spell it, please?
Super Kanja, Kandja. I think I'm saying it correctly. But Chef Pierre Chiam, Thiam, owns a restaurant called Taranga in Harlem, New York. And he's come to New Orleans plenty of times. And I think there's a documentary that I have, an interview that I have on YouTube between Senegalese chef Pierre Chiam and the academic director of the Whitney Plantation, Dr. Ibrahim Asek. And they talk in depth about the relationships and the similarities between Senegalese cuisine and Louisiana Creole cuisine.
Okay. And I'm just double checking. What was the Nigerian soup that you correlated yakamine to? Is that a different question from last time?
Yes, that is a different question.
Okay, so I'll ask that one then. What was the Nigerian soup that correlated, that you
Pepper soup, catfish pepper soup. Okay. Pepper, just pepper. The flavor is very similar. I have, traveled throughout West Africa, and my cousins, actually I have two first cousins whose father is Nigerian. And I was always amazed at how similar, Nigerian pepper soup is to yakamine. So it's the flavors. The tongue has memory, right? It might not necessarily be, the exact replication, but I do feel that many of the dishes that we have, we are always searching for the flavor and memory of what our ancestors once ate, and sometimes not even realizing it.
That's good. Thank you. What are typical Creole desserts?
Kala, there was, a dish that came, a treat that came out that I saw a lot in the research, estomac mulâtre. I'm not sure if my French is really bad, but my Spanish is good. But it's a ginger cake. So they would sell ginger cake throughout there. Was also coconut. There was also like coconut confectionaries. There were also pink pralines at one time. Pink pralines. I found that a lot in the research. And I know Madame Trevine also remembered eating pink pralines. So there were, figs, they would, women would sing in Creole, and they call themselves the marchand. Marchand means vendor, street vendor in French. So they would call them marchand. Du gâteau, which means cake vendor. Marchand what's the other word I'm looking for? They fig. So figs, they would sell figs. There were, there's a couple of books out there from the 1940s, and I had my niece, who was actually a graphic designer, redesign some of these illustrations that I saw of street food vendors. So there was a chimney sweep street food vendor. There was a popcorn man, the oyster man, the watermelon man. I mean, there was every kind of street vendor in New Orleans. And even if you go back to one of my slides, you'll see a woman standing on the stairs and collecting some canteens that were very similar to, what you see in India, with steel tin cans. And it was hot food. Hello? Oh, go back. Yeah. It was hot food that was sold from door to door, and it was, Uber Eats before there was Uber Eats, and it was usually prepared by Black women and then someone in their family. A man or a young man would deliver it from door to door. So there were many, and like I said, during slavery, many of the slave owners, including some of the most wealthy ones, John McDonough and Etienne de Bory, they made tremendous profit from sending their enslaved, people out into the streets of New Orleans to sell for them. And it was tax-free, right? They received all the profit. Now, in some cases, like Rose Nicaud, she was able to, get a portion of the profits that were sold, and it depended on who your owner was, right? And I'm sure, some of them found a way to kind of finagle so they could, keep a little extra for themselves, but risking their lives, because if it was probably, depending on who your owner was, if he was cruel or not, you could probably be killed for something like that. And then, also understanding the Code Noir that, restricted the amount that enslaved street vendors could make from the price that they could sell their things at. So they were probably in fear of them making too much money, right? Because then that, could curtail, they didn't want enslaved people to make, wealth. They wanted to continue them to be free labor, basically.
Thank you. So we'll we'll end on that note. You all have been a great audience. Zella, amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Has been giving you rave reviews. But
thank you all.
Learned so much, all in the chat. So you all, thank you for your love. Thank you to this amazing audience. There's still so many questions, but we answered a good bit. You all actually had 45 minutes worth of
Tiffin
Q&A.
carriers, thank you. Sorry, somebody just said that. Thank you, Tiffin carriers, thank you.
Tiffin carriers. So thank you so much, Zella, for spending your
Thank you all.
evening with us. Thank you all for spending your evening with us. We really enjoyed you all. Don't forget, when we send that email, fill out the survey at a later date. Everyone who's registered, we will send an email out to that bibliography list that you all were asking about.
Yes.
And don't forget, visit our shop. We do have Creole cookery, which would help. It's in that same genre of sort of what you all were referencing as it relates to the Picayune Creole cookbook. So ours was published in 1885, just roughly 15, 16 years before that. So please visit our website to start your research on buying those types of cookbooks, and we will send that bibliography soon. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Zella. It was amazing.
Thank you all for having me. I couldn't reveal all of my research because hopefully, I'm putting it all together. It's been years, decades of research, and I'm working on a book. So I couldn't reveal everything to y'all, but it is, it's coming, and it is fascinating to read the stories of, enslaved cooks in New Orleans and Louisiana. And we have such a unique, and I'm hoping any chefs or foodies and home cooks out there that they do purchase these books and bring back these dishes because they have a story to tell. And we have to stop mentioning, Africa as the last. Africa had a huge contribution on Louisiana Creole cuisine, and with the agriculture as well as the culinary dishes that many of us love and have been passed down from generation to generation. So I'm hoping that you also become members of the Hermann-Grima Gallier Historic House, and that you continue to support the incredible work that Dr. Anastasia Scott and Tessa Jagger are doing at both historic houses.
Thank you. You all have a good night.
Have a good night. Bye, everyone. Be safe.